Hey guys, in lab today we're going to be exploring plants. So I'm going to take you guys outside and we're going to look around my yard and see what kind of plants we can find. I'm pretty sure I can find all 4 divisions just hanging out in my front yard. Alright, so the first division we're going to investigate is the Bryophytes. So right next to my house I've actually found some moss. Okay, so we're going to flip around my camera so you guys can take a look. So these are some moss. You can see that they're in a nice shady spot. They're actually hanging out right near my hose, so they have access to water. Okay, so for comparison in size, you can see that these guys are not very large. They're small and almost fluffy. So my kids actually like to pet these. These little stalks are actually what remains of the sporophyte. So these guys are already finished with their reproductive cycle, but they used to have little capsules at the end of these stalks so that they could spread spores. So here's another section of the same moss. This section got tore up the other day while I was mowing, but I wanted to show you guys that this small fluffy moss, when you flip it over, doesn't have true roots. So there are some short rhizoids in here. Okay, and these are root-like structures, but they do not have the thick vascular tissue in it that make these big and complex. So remember, these mosses are non-vascular. So no vascular tissue in their leaf-like structures, no vascular system in their roots, so they're not actually roots, they're rhizoids. Seedless non-vascular plants also include things like moss, hornworts, and liverworts. So the next kind of plant we can talk about are the seedless vasculars. That includes things like this fern. So my little fern's not doing so great, but you can see that this guy has true leaves. If you look really close, you can see the vascular tissue branching within those leaves. On the underside, we actually see the sori, which are spore-producing structures. So these guys are still using spores in their life cycle. Those spores will spread and grow a tiny little gametophyte. Other seedless vascular plants include the lagophytes, such as club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts, as well as the manilophytes, ferns, whisk ferns, and horsetails. Next on our tour of plants is the division Gymnosperm. This one is a lot easier to find. These can be very large and obvious plants like pine trees or this cycad. Cycads tend to be southern plants. So they are potted plants often used as ornamentals here in North Carolina, but they're wild in places more like Florida and South America. So these guys produce cones down in the middle of the plant, kind of down here. This guy is not reproducing at the moment, so there's no plant or no cone present. Okay, but this is a cycad. You can see it kind of has a fern-like or type of leaf, but again, vascular tissue is present. This is a large, complex plant, and these guys produce seeds in the cones whenever they're ready to reproduce. Another great example of a gymnosperm are pine trees. Living in the South, pine trees are pretty much everywhere. So this is one of the many pine trees I have in my yard. You can see that they get to be very, very large. Okay. So these have a strong trunk, okay, that is a woody structure, and these are still cone producers. So if we look here on the ground, you can see that I actually have some pine cones that have fallen out of the tree. So this is a female pine cone. Okay, the spiky structures are for protection. These spiky structures are called scales. Down inside the scales, can't see it right now, okay, but that's where the seeds are produced. These seeds are actually winged, and the seeds will fly out of the cones when they're ready to disperse and fly around the yard looking for a new place to grow. So pine cones actually come in different shapes and sizes depending on the species. This is just one of the types that I have in my yard. Male cones are much smaller than this female cone. They do not have these hard pointy scales, and they produce pollen instead of seeds. In addition to cycads and conifers like the pine tree, Gymnosperm also includes things like the ginkgo biloba and the netophytes. So for our hunt for angiosperms, we're going to start here in my sad little garden. And we know that angiosperm have both flowers and fruit. Okay, the fruit develop from the fertilized flower. So on these plants we can see that my peas have a pretty white flower. Okay, that's going to be fertilized, and then as it develops it will grow into a beanstalk. So this beanstalk contains the seeds of the plant, okay, and it is a type of odd fruit. Another example is my poor sad tomato plant. You'll have to forgive me, I've had a hornworm helping itself to all of my veggies this year. But we can see that this tomato plant has 3 nice juicy fruit. Okay, these are developing, and if we were to cut those tomatoes open, we would see lots of seeds on the inside. So angiosperm are everywhere. This plant here has some purple berries. And this is a great example of a coevolution. And these red and purple berries actually attract the birds, and the birds will help spread those seeds after they eat the berries. So the bird gets a nice reward, that sweet fruit, and in exchange it's going to take that seed and transfer it somewhere else so that it can grow. Angiosperm truly are everywhere. Don't judge my poor yard. All of these grasses and plants down here are all angiosperm. There are several types of grasses. Okay, we can see flowers, even our little dandelion flowers. That's a great example of an angiosperm. Okay, these little guys will be pollinated by bees, butterflies, flies. And when it's all done, we'll actually get these little dandelion fluffs, which allow the spread of the seeds. Here are some other examples of angiosperm. So this plant will again attract pollinators with those pretty flowers. We can see the green sepals on the outside of these buds protecting the flower as it develops before it opens into this big pretty thing with the petals, allowing for pollinators to fertilize it. Okay, aloe is another cool example of an angiosperm. This guy reproduces asexually a lot of the times by fragmentation or budding, but it also can produce flowers. So I have a poinsettia back here. That poinsettia is another example of an angiosperm. Angiosperm come in many shapes and sizes. This is creeping Virginia. It's a vine type angiosperm that loves to grow up and around other structures like this rail. Okay. Poison ivy is another good example of a vine-like angiosperm, one that produces an oil that causes itchiness in animals and prevents herbivores from eating it. So we've seen some smaller types of angiosperm. These plants can also get larger. So these bushes are angiosperm, as well as most of the trees that we see around. So that tree is actually, I believe, a sweet gum tree, maybe a maple. Oak tree is another very large example of an angiosperm. This one will produce flowers and eventually acorns. Oak trees rely on animals like squirrels to help them disperse their seeds. Those squirrels will bury acorns, often forgetting where they are buried, allowing them to sprout into brand new trees. I hope you've enjoyed this little video tour looking at the 4 divisions of plants. And get outside, go explore your own yard, see what you guys can find. There's lots of diversity all around us. I want to give a special thanks to my co-narrator, Tier, and to the Cicada Chorus, who has provided background music to all of my outside videos.